So welcome everybody, and Colin, do you want to go to the next slide? Yes, so for the students, just a few announcements tonight. One of them is this week is the week, on Friday is the deadline to let your TA know what you're going to choose for your final assignment this semester. So remember, you have 3 options. They're detailed in the assignment section and instructions in the content section of CourseLink. And then you let your TA know what your topic is, just running it by them. It doesn't need to be detailed. It can be a sentence. This is a very informal process. We're just trying to keep you on track and set you up for success in the course. And then, of course, we didn't have seminars last week, but because we had a panel, we're a little bit confusing, optional panel. Just to let you know, the seminars are starting this week again. So you'll have a seminar either tomorrow, Thursday, or Friday. Yes, Catalan, you can send an email is sufficient to your TA. And as I said, it can be a sentence. This is a pretty informal process. Do not overthink it. It's just to make sure you're on the right track. And then, yeah, as usual, your TAs are always there if you have questions about the course, the structure, the assignments, and then you can also reach us at univ2020@uoguelph.ca. And then next slide.
Right. So last week was what we called the optional but awesome reading week panel. We have recorded it, and I recommend in the strongest possible terms that if you did not manage to take part last week or you've not watched the recording, that you check it out. I would argue this was one of the most powerful evenings we've had in a semester full of great evenings, but this one was really remarkable. So I would take the time to have a look at that recording. The link is there. It'll be made available in CourseLink for the students. It's already up actually, and it will also be shared with the alumni. It was just a really amazing discussion. So very, very strongly recommend checking that one out.
Yeah, and Ryan, I'll mention that sorry, I'm just looking at really quickly Natalie's question about your TA. It's not in the syllabus, but if you email Colin at univ2020, he will tell you who your TA is, or if you attend your seminar. And then in terms of the panel last week, if you choose option 3 for the final assignment, you have to watch the panel because the final assignment, the first one's a research essay, your first option, your second option is a creative piece. Your third option is directly tied to the rapid response collecting project of the Guelph Civic Museum. So you have to watch the panel to do the third option for the assignment. And as usual, do you want to talk about that? Because Kokulu is being friendly.
I think everyone is pretty aware of the process here. So the Zoom chat is used for questions, and we will try to get through as many as we possibly can. We very often have more than we can get to, but it's still useful to see what people are thinking and what the questions are that come up. It helps us to shape future discussions as well. And as always, you can have additional discussions in your seminar groups, on CourseLink, or in any other chat setups that have been arranged for the course. So we really like the participation. It's been fantastic so far, and we'll just keep doing it the way we've been doing it.
Okay, so we're so pleased tonight to talk about COVID-19 and the food system with our 4 guests, and I'll introduce Emily first. So Emily Duncan is a PhD student in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Geomatics. Her research interests include global food security, technology adoption, political ecology, and sustainability. Her current PhD research is focused on the social consequences of digital agriculture technologies and the global governance of agri-food data. And it is conducted, I believe, with Evan Fraser as your advisor. Yes? Okay, so welcome. Thank you so much for being here, Emily. And I think you have a PowerPoint to share.
Yes, I do. Thank you so much to this class for having me. Yeah, I'm excited to share some research that took place last summer And it's not directly tied to my thesis research. This was at a point when I was kind of making a pivot. As Sophie mentioned, my research is about digital agriculture. And so right as the pandemic hit, I was gearing up to go to Ghana to do fieldwork, and then that was canceled. So now, over the summer, I did this project in relation to the food system and COVID-19, and I'm really happy to share some of the results with this group today. So I'm going to go and share my screen and hope this works. Does this look like a PowerPoint to everyone? Okay, good. So the name of my project was Foods Frontline Workers, COVID-19 through the eyes of grocery retail employees. And this research was conducted in conjunction with Dr. Eric Nost and our URA, Eric Scheibel. And part of this research was really personal to me. It's kind of sparked why I wanted to study this. My mom has worked in grocery retail for over 10 years. And when the pandemic hit, she was telling me all these different kinds of stories about things that were going on in the store. At one point, she felt sick and got tested for COVID. It was a really stressful time. And so a lot was happening in the grocery retail environment. And what I wanted to do was do a project that kind of captured some of those experiences for these workers who, at a time when a pandemic was hitting, were having to process and check out 300 or 400 orders a day. So it was really stressful time. And so I'll get into some of the results of the research. So the main question that we were trying to answer was, how have grocery store employees been witness to the effects of COVID-19 on our food system? So a lot of these workers were on food's front lines to see what the effects were. And we had 3 research objectives with this project: to establish observed trends and patterns in consumer shopping habits and supply chain challenges. We wanted to create a timeline of some of the protective measures that were put in place and the technologies that were used in the grocery retail environment, and explore frontline workers' personal narratives about the challenges they experienced during this time. So I'll talk a bit generally about methods, because I know this is an interdisciplinary course. Not everyone's a social scientist. But the main method we used here was oral history. So we interviewed participants, and the general purpose of an oral history, it's a little bit different than a semi-structured interview, because it's trying to create a collection of memories and commentaries based on an event of historical significance, which arguably the pandemic is, and to make the interview more of a conversation and a collaboration. So really trying to make sure that our participants felt comfortable sharing some of these experiences that were sometimes emotional or sometimes very frustrating. And it's a commitment to documenting lesser heard voices. So throughout the pandemic, we've been hearing a lot of different commentaries from different people. And to me, it was really important that the people who are kind of on the front lines at grocery stores had a chance to share their experiences through this research. And so I'll give you a bit of rundown of the participants that we had. So we conducted 29 interviews from July to September. The interviews lasted approximately 45 minutes to an hour, and they were all done virtually. We also compensated all our participants $30 for participating for their time. We had 10 male and 19 female participants. And everybody had we got a range of different roles within the grocery store: cashiers, front-end workers, people who are doing online orders in different sections of the grocery store, such as the deli, bakery, dairy section, and also supervisors and managers. It wasn't just associates. And it was both full-time and part-time workers. And I'll note the majority of workers were part-time, because something that I learned during this research is that some grocery stores don't even have any full-time workers. They only hire part-time workers. And so these are some of the stores that we covered. All the stores were based in Guelph. So if you live in Guelph, you probably shop at one of these places. So we included all the major Canadian retail chains. So that would be Loblaws, Bears and No Frills, Metro and Food Basics owned by Sobeys, Walmart, and Freshco. We excluded grocery stores that are more specialty type grocery stores, like in Guelph, like Market Fresh or Goodness Me, because we really wanted this survey to kind of be, this interview to be a bit of more general to workers' experiences across Canada. We also did not include Costco because their practices are a little bit different due to them being a membership-based grocery store. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the results. So when we think about when these interviews happened, it was July 5th to September. So it was really asking the participants about from March 2020 onwards. And so there were a lot of commonalities about how workers described the beginning of the pandemic. Toilet paper came up for sure. And supply chain challenges. So the idea that sometimes shelves were bare at the beginning, that these workers were working really, really hard to make sure that things were on the shelves, that customers were adhering to limits that were put in place so that there was food availability for everybody. And this was also just around the time that Guelph put in the bylaw that masks were required. So we got to learn a little bit more about how workers felt as different stages of precautions were put into place. And a lot of workers were really grateful that the bylaw about masks was put into place and starting to be enforced. This is right around the time that plexiglass had been put into most of the stores and the arrows down the aisles, which sparked an interesting conversation of trying to get customers to adhere to these rules. And got to hear a lot of interesting stories. So the next kind of focus of results is on grocery store technologies. One thing that I was particularly interested in was learning about self-checkout machines. So we know that this is a growing trend in our grocery stores, that you can check out your own groceries. But in this time of a pandemic, almost all our participants said that these were grossly underused. People just didn't want to go to them. People were processing large orders, sometimes upwards of $500, $700. They're not going to use the self-checkout machine. They need the expertise of a cashier. Secondly, there was a lot of talk about Instacart shoppers. So as many people are probably aware, Instacart is an online grocery delivery service like Uber for groceries. And a lot of participants in the grocery store had some very interesting stories about Instacart shoppers, mainly that a lot of these shoppers would come up to them and ask them where things were because they were doing shopping for someone else, which some employees found particularly annoying. No offense to anyone if you are an Instacart shopper. And finally was the rise in online grocery orders, which I know some of the other panelists are going to talk about a bit more. So I'll leave that to them, but I will just say a significant number of our participants were shifted from their work within the grocery store to still online orders. And some of them were actually new hires that were specifically hired to fill the demand for rising online orders. Challenges. This is a part that was really important to capture. And while we asked participants about what the challenges were, we also asked them if customers had feelings of gratitude or expressed that gratitude to them. And they definitely said yes, and talked about different times that people had been especially kind to them. But overall, there was an agreement that the atmosphere in the grocery store had changed during the time of the pandemic, and that the emotional labor of being in such a risky situation with people who are also under the stress of a pandemic was particularly challenging. And it came to light in a few different stories. One that made headlines, which was the first one, in a store, a employee was spat on by an irritable customer. And as this quote says from one of our participants, it had a very negative effect on her, and that it took them a while for to get the guy because there was security footage, and there was really no store enforcement of this. In another example, there was a lot of temp workers because they needed the extra help, and so there were probably 12 people in a small space. And distancing is really hard when you have that many workers. And a random customer came by and took a picture of all the workers standing too close together and not following distancing rules. And as this worker described, she was really concerned that this customer was going to send it to public health and that they would all be fined. There was a fear of workers that if they did not follow the rules while on the job, they'd receive a fine of up to $700 to $1,000. And a lot of the stores explicitly said that they would not be supportive if that did happen. And so I have, and then my final result focuses around compensation. And so in March to June 2020, workers from all the stores that we interviewed were given an additional $2 heroes pay. And so that was something that workers had a lot of opinions about. They were grateful that, most were grateful that it happened, but then also that heroes pay was taken away in June 2020 and it never came back. So many people felt that the risk was still there. The other point that we wanted to talk about in terms of compensation for grocery store workers was that even if you are a full-time grocery store worker working 40 hours a week, you are still making less than what the CERB was giving out, which was $2,000 a month. So a lot of people felt undervalued in that way. And like this quotation from one participant asking themselves, like, is it worth working if you can just stay at home and not be on the front lines? So that was a theme that came up about, you know, a lot of people thought the CERB was a good government program, but it didn't take into account minimum wage workers like themselves. And finally, we talked a lot about what it means to be essential. And I really like this quotation from one participant. And now I've gone back. At the beginning, when no stores were open, I was like, I feel essential right now. And I'd worked at grocery stores in the past, but I'd never thought of it as essential. I just thought of this as some random part-time job. I wanted to help out during the pandemic. And just because I'm healthy and I thought, well, I don't mind. This was a younger participant. There's like a lot of older ladies in the store, which weren't able to sell. And I wanted to replace them and help out for that because I'm able to. I can kind of keep the feeling that grocery stores are essential workers because we are so important. And a lot of participants shared the sentiment that before the pandemic, they just thought of this as a job and they weren't an essential part of society. But I think that COVID-19 has really brought that to light, that these are essential workers. And so going forward, I'll just wrap up and say that a lot of this research is trying to promote more fairness and justice within our food system. Workers within our food system deserve a living wage. Even with the $2 heroes pay, all of those workers in Guelph are not able to, even working full time at that rate, it's still not a living wage for Guelph. Living wage for Guelph is $17.10. And living wage signifies like, what does it cost to have, you know, minimal housing, minimal food requirements for a person. And now there's an ongoing fight for frontline essential workers to be prioritized for vaccination. And this should include grocery store employees because they're the ones who are interacting with the public every day, just like doctors and nurses. So what I hope is that this research will shed some light on some of these issues of justice within our food system, and that these conversations will continue. So I'll just wrap up there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Emily. And we actually have a participant in your study tonight who has just told us that she's so grateful to have been part of the study. How awesome is that? Yeah, one of the many reasons I love this course. Well, that's a great study. And we've been talking about students in the pandemic and the kind of research they can do. And so this is a great example. What a great project. I'm going to take my reading glasses. This is, I don't know, Kuko Leo is really vocal tonight. It's not tonight. So our next presenter is Professor Evan Fraser who's a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Global Food Security and the Director of the Arel Food Institute, where he is leading multidisciplinary teams focused on developing solutions to help feed the world's growing population while not destroying the ecosystems on which we depend for life. He is also a fellow of the Trudeau Foundation and of the Royal Canadian Geographic Society. His academic training is in forestry, anthropology, and agriculture. And in addition to his numerous academic publications, he frequently writes in popular publications and is interviewed in the media on food and food insecurity. Evan is also the author of the nonfiction book, Empires of Food, Feast, Famine, and the Rise and Fall of Civilizations, which was published by Simon & Schuster and shortlisted for the James Beard Food Literature Award. Thank you so much for being with us, Evan, tonight. And as I said, you're one of 3 panelists that we had last semester that we brought back this semester.
So thank you. And hopefully one of Emily's empty grocery store shelves is on the screen. Someone just give me a quick thumbs up. You can hear me and see that. All right. Awesome. So nice to be here. And this is actually, we didn't plan it, did we, Emily, or anybody else? But this is a perfect liftoff segue from what you just heard, because my story starts with those empty grocery store shelves and then moves on in time to perhaps the tidal wave of food waste that happened when the restaurants and cafeterias closed, to the concerns raised back in March and April and May by farmers about whether they would be able to bring the foreign workers they rely into the country. And of course, that moment back in April when about 3/4 of Canada's beef processing capacity was closed as workers in those plants tested positive for the virus. So for me, like for Kimberly and Simon, who you're about to hear, for Emily, who you just heard from, for me, a food systems guy based here at the University of Guelph, March and April was a whirlwind when a lot of us were really trying to make sense of what COVID meant for the food system. And a response that some of us came up with was to create a program we called Growing Stronger, aiming for resilience in the Canadian food system. And this little lecture is designed to introduce you to Growing Stronger and the findings of this program. So starting at the beginning, what was Growing Stronger? Back at the beginning of the lockdown, almost if it's hard to imagine, a year ago, a good friend of mine named Rory McAlpine from the very large Canadian company called Maple Leaf called me up and he said he really hoped some organization like the University of Guelph would embark on a process to learn the lessons from COVID for the food system. And Rory was concerned that people like him who were trying to keep our grocery store shelves full, they were too distracted with the day-to-day management of the food system to actually pause and reflect. So a group of us, including Rory, came up with the idea of doing Growing Stronger, and we pulled together a team that pretty much represented every facet of the Canadian food system. We had the head of major farm organizations, senior people in the retail sector, people who ran both very large and very small food processing operations, people who understood about farm labor, small farmers, Indigenous representation, community groups, food security activists, nutritionists, and of course, a few academics like me. And what we did is essentially what we're doing tonight. We hosted online webinars. We listened to each other's perspectives. I did interviews all the way across the food chain last July, August, September. We did a student survey about the effects of COVID on students' food insecurity. We collected information, and then we distilled things down into a final report. So that brings me to what we actually found. And at a high level, everybody that I interviewed or interacted with told us that the food system during the pandemic bent but didn't break, but that it came close to breaking in a number of key moments, especially last spring. Second, we get to the sort of what were the direct effects when the system bent but didn't break. And I think these can be sort of divided roughly into 2 categories. The first big effect of COVID on the food system picks up directly on what Emily was just saying. It had to do with labor. And in particular, we have to acknowledge that a tremendous number of the people who work in the food system caught COVID and were vulnerable to disease. So this includes not only the grocery store retail folks that Emily was talking to, but also the temporary foreign workers that come to Canada every year to pick apples and plant asparagus and prune trees and whatnot, as well as the workers in the meatpacking plant. So labor was a huge issue over the course of the summer. The second big effect of COVID was related more to the economic cost of the lockdown, the unemployment, the loss of businesses, especially for the restaurant industry. The economic cost of COVID meant that food insecurity in our country has skyrocketed, and food banks have never, ever been busier. The third thing we learned about the problems caused by COVID on our food system is actually there's very little new going on here. We already knew that we in Canada had a problem with labor in the agri-food sector. And for instance, the temporary foreign worker program that brings farm workers from Mexico and the Caribbean into Canada every year, it was actually established in the 1960s. And in the 1960s, it was intended to be a short-term stopgap measure to address what was then seen as a temporary labor problem. 60 years later, we are structurally dependent on that system. Similarly, we already knew that Canada had an immoral food insecurity problem, and that simply too many Canadians cannot afford the cost of a healthy diet. Food banks were actually started in the 1980s, again, then seen as a short-term stopgap to a food insecurity problem that we as a society now depend on. So it's important to realize, I think, that in terms of the food system, I don't believe COVID created very many new problems as much as it revealed or brought to the surface long-standing problems that we were already vulnerable to. So that brings me then to the so what statement. What do we want to say about how to move forward? What are our recommendations? And that interdisciplinary team that led the Growing Stronger initiative, after much debate, settled on 3 key messages that we think make sense for Canada as a whole. And the first recommendation has to do with food insecurity. As I just said, we live in a country that has for too long had a major problem with food insecurity, and the pandemic has made that problem worse. But it is important to realize that food insecurity is not, I can't underscore this enough, is not a problem related to agriculture, farms, food processing, or food retail. Rather, food insecurity is related to poverty, inequality, low wages, and the high cost of living. Food insecurity also, and we have to acknowledge this, also has strong racial and colonial elements. And we know that new Canadians, racialized folks, Indigenous communities are far more likely to experience food insecurity than other folks. So as a result, if our country, if we as Canadians want a better future, if we want to ensure that we are resilient to the next big problem in our food system, we need to address the root causes of food insecurity, which is we need to address poverty. The second big recommendation that we're making in Growing Stronger relates to agriculture and the environment and the economy. So at the same time as the folks I was interviewing in the fall were discussing the challenges related to labor and whatnot, people were also identifying that agriculture can and should be a driver of what many people describe as green or environmentally friendly economic development. I heard there are new technologies like smart tractors or vertical farms being developed, and that these technologies could, we hope, result in less greenhouse gas emissions, better local food production, less water pollution, and create jobs. As a result, I'm going to say that I'm getting a widespread sense that there is a optimism that now is the moment for governments to prioritize the agricultural sector and put it at the cornerstone of a green economic recovery platform. The third major recommendation that comes out of the Growing Stronger program was the need for better collaboration between sectors, between governments, between businesses, civil society, and academics. And everybody I talked to said for too long have we worked in silos, and all the interviews I did over the summer and into the fall suggest there needs to be mechanisms to help bring people with an interest in food systems together to share priorities. And this was actually achieved a bit of a breakthrough this week, partly as a result of the pandemic and the problems kicked up by the pandemic, partly as a result of a lot of effort by a lot of people over many years. Just last week, the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada announced the creation of a new National Food Policy Advisory Council that is made up of experts from across the food system, retailers, food security experts, etc. And the Food Policy Council is designed to help provide ongoing advice to government on important food-related issues, perhaps to create more resilience so that we don't run into the problems that we ran into last spring. And it's this sort of mechanism that I think we need to be embracing in terms of creating more collaboration. So by way of conclusion, let me just say that if you remember nothing else from this little lecture, you can jot these 4 points down. First of all, COVID's impact seems to have been major on the food system, but many of the problems caused by COVID were actually longstanding issues that came to the surface during the crisis. The second point I'd like you to remember is that if we want to be more resilient, we have to be addressing the root causes of food insecurity, which really focuses us on poverty and racism and inequality, and many of the issues, the structural issues that Emily touched on in terms of the cost of living wages and the disconnect between what we pay workers and what it actually costs to survive. The third key point is there is a widespread sense of optimism that now is the moment to position agriculture as an engine of economic growth that is environmentally sound. And there's even a sense of optimism that Canada should aspire to become the world's superpower in terms of producing clean, healthy, and sustainable food. And fourth and not least, we will only realize these sort of opportunities if we develop strategies to foster collaboration. Strategies like the new National Food Policy Advisory Council that will bring industry, civil society, academics, and government together. And also include, the processors, the retailers, the consumers, and of course, the communities. So with that being said, I'd like to say thank you very, very much for the opportunity to come to this class, and back to you, Sophie. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Blair asked if he saw you at the bottom of the Canadian Food Policy Advisory Council member. He did, right?
Yeah. So I've got a new
That's awesome.
I've got a new volunteer gig to keep me up at night.
Well, Evan's being a little too shy about it because he is the co-chair of the Canadian Food Policy Advisory Council.
Oh, yes, you are being too shy. Thank you, Simon. Ryan, I'll let you introduce our next guest.
I will indeed, and you've actually just heard a little bit him calling out Evan for being too modest. It's great to have you here tonight, Simon. So Dr. Simon Simoyi holds the Errol Chair in Business of Food and is director of the Longo's Food Retail Laboratory in the School of Hospitality, Food and Tourism Management. Over the past decade, he's led and contributed to value chain projects in numerous countries and created consumer-driven food supply chains, linking members of the chain from input supply and primary production to retail, particularly in the beverage, seafood, and horticulture sectors. These projects generally result in a more efficient food supply chain that creates and delivers food more abundantly and with less waste, with more profitability and more economic sustainability for all members of the chain. In 2020, he received funding from the COVID-19 Catalyst Fund at the University of Guelph for a project entitled How Has COVID-19 Impacted the Sustainability Initiatives of Restaurants? A Case Study Analysis. Simon, it's great to have you with us tonight.
Thank you, Ryan. Let me share my screen. Okay, let's blow it up. Alrighty, everyone can see that? Thumbs up, all good. So once again, Ryan, thank you. As Ryan said, I'm from the School of Hospitality, Food and Tourism Management, and we were lucky enough to receive a grant from the University of Guelph over the summer to do work on a project looking at food service and how it was impacted by COVID-19. We also got another grant that looks at how COVID-19 impacts food consumers at grocery stores, but that's what Kimberly will be talking about afterwards, so I'll let her go on that. So the project on food service also involved Bruce, Kimberly was involved, and Emily Robinson as well. So I'm just going to briefly go through some of the highlights of what we did and what we found out. COVID-19 was tough on the whole Canadian food system, very much globally as well, but it particularly impacted the food service sector. And by that, I mean restaurants, catering, fast food. It was really one of the few businesses in the food supply chain that was ordered by the government to shut. If you look at farms, processing, retailing, other forms of retailing, they were open, but they really got hit hard. So it was really interesting to see, how did they cope? What did they do? And we wanted to track that a little bit over time, because we did see a gradual change from periods of lockdown to that stage reopening. It really impacted them all, whether they were what we call high service or full service restaurants, where you've got, very much focus on a business model of supplying high quality food at high price, all the way down to fast food, which is a quick service, food service, which is really about your McDonald's, your KFC, those types of businesses, of which the fast food industry probably did best, because it's really about getting food out quickly. It doesn't require you to sit in a restaurant. It focuses on takeout and delivery to some extent as well. So, but we want to look across the board, and particularly looking at the catering aspects and the restaurant aspects. We also had been doing some work previous to this study on the sustainability initiatives of restaurants in Canada, and this is prior to COVID. So we were looking more at issues related to single-use plastic use, living wages, those types of things. So we really want to see how COVID messed that up. So we want to look at what they were doing during that lockdown, during reopening, and how, from a business management perspective, and I'm a business management academic, looking at their decision-making processes. And we want to also look, as I said before, at those economic, social, environmental sustainability initiatives and how they've been impacted. So what did we do? It was what we call a qualitative study. It involved in-depth interviews. These interviews are similar to what Emily talked about, are sort of about 45 minutes or so in length to an hour, across the 2-month period between June and August last year. And we were focusing on 3 establishments. They were restaurants, and one was a catering business spread in BC, Manitoba, and Ontario. And we did the 24 interviews with those 3 establishments across the 2 months. Alrighty, so what did we find out? So we sort of took the data that we gathered and broke it up into what I would call phases, for want of a better term. So I'll go through the 3 phases that we observed during that reopening stages, the 2 months of our data collection. So at the very early stages, many of them were coming just out of lockdown. They were in survival mode. They were, particularly under lockdown, many were unable to open their businesses, and then trying to work out ways of doing that. There was a lot of frustration amongst business managers on misinformation, issues around sanitization, PPE, a lot of complexity and time and effort spent on understanding government subsidy programs, and just general uncertainty for these people about what was going to happen. I mean, we've never really been through anything like this on a global extent before. And most of them wanted to keep their employees. They want to employ people that, they're not just employees, they're friends, they're co-workers. So trying to work out how to maximize their number of employees while having to be as tight financially as possible, which was tricky. Then as we move past that first month into sort of the second month, we're moving out of that survival mode. They were what I call tweaking. They were tweaking their business models, tweaking what they did to suit their new environment. You saw restaurants starting to offer meal kits, offering prepackaged food that then could be delivered and made at home. We saw far more use of food delivery apps, Skip the Dishes, Uber Eats, those types of things, which run a very different business model. They were impacted by food price increases across the board. Once again, they were still working to understand what health regulations they could face. Remember, when we opened up, you could have people in your store, but in your restaurant, but you had to have distancing, working out all those issues, working out with PPE. And a lot of the sustainability initiatives that they were trying to do before, like reducing single-use plastics, was really thrown out the door because for sanitization reasons, they had to, get rid of plastic, get rid of, a good example is, things like menus, those types of things where, they could only be used once, but there was ways around that. We saw a lot of mental health issues amongst workers and managers who were spending a lot of time, being uncertain about their business. These aren't high-wage jobs like many of us on this call, on this webinar have, but it was a very tricky time, and there were a lot of long hours understanding regulation and filling in forms, making sure they could get the government assistance that was out there. And then we flowed into that sort of final stage closer to August, where there was businesses were what we call refocusing. They changed their business models to being very much about, in the past, maybe they were very focused on in-restaurant consumption, then moved on to the meal kits, then moved on to other ways of delivering those sort of things and planning for the future. And I think the planning for the future part was quite important. Many of them were talking about actually creating formalized plans of what to do in a crisis moving forward, particularly if managers get sick, what do you do? If suppliers can't provide product, what can you do? Really looking at, being smart and being proactive and thinking what we do in the future in regards to our people, our employees, our managers, and also the products that we offer. And, that in a lot of cases meant that cutting down the number of items on a menu, price increases, but being smart for the future. So if you could summarize everything that we found out, I think it fits in these 4 things here. Environmental sustainability was not a top priority, and it was a good opportunity to understand that in a lot of cases, environmental and social sustainability sits on the shoulders of economic sustainability, and the economic sustainability of many of these businesses was shaky, I should say. Operationally, they were thinking very much short-term rather than long-term, but as they got later into the phases, or the third phase, they were thinking, well, how can we come out of this better going forward? Managing people was important. Making sure that they could keep their workers was important, but within reason. And the strong thing that really did come out was the complexity of having to deal with federal government assistance programs, local government assistance programs, provincial government assistance programs, the complexity of health regulations and PPE regulations, whole set of different things which weren't necessarily communicated timely and clearly. Of course, we're academics, so we have to get some academic benefit out of this. This is really interesting stuff, but it's very descriptive in nature, and we want to publish out of this, and that's important. And a lot of the work that we did, which I haven't discussed today because it's pretty dry stuff, is about managerial decision-making during crises. And particularly, there's a lot of literature that talks about natural disasters and emergency management, and then these types of disasters, which are more human-based, where the disaster management processes, and particularly around, you could link to some of the government subsidy programs and other types of assistance, sort of fit within the 2 areas that I've mentioned there. So with that, I had questions, but we'll leave questions to the end. So thank you. Listen to me. I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much. That was great. I was frantically writing down some questions of my own during that. So I think we'll get to that just after one more presentation. And so I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Kimberly Thomas Francois, who's a postdoctoral fellow in the School of Hospitality, Food and Tourism Management in the Lang School of Business and Economics. She has a PhD in management with a specialization in service management, including a focus on smart and virtual food retailing. Some of her publications include the impact of customer engagement and service leadership on local food value chain of hotels, strengthening farmers, hotel supply chain relationships, a service management approach, and spices and agritourism in Grenada, Isle of Spice in the Caribbean. So we're really happy to have your perspective tonight as well, Kimberly. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Ryan. Let me see if I can share my screen here. Okay, so it's such a pleasure to be here, and I'm really excited. I must say that we started this research before COVID, and I do feel a bit guilty because when COVID happened, I was like, aha, I expected some changes. And so I was really excited about what is coming. And fortunately, we actually received a grant and we were able to do some research during the summer to learn more about virtual grocery shopping. And we specifically also look into the impact on Canadian consumers. So you will hear a bit of that in the end. Just a bit of an interview. So I would just go through to talk about who are the pre-COVID shoppers, the consumer segments. You might be able to identify yourself to see where you sit. The COVID-19 risk aversion. That's the part that I felt guilty about. And the key insights on the virtual shopper, the impact on, and then finally I'll touch on the impact on the Canadian. Sorry, I haven't. Sorry about that. I'm having some problems with my slide here. So, so who are the pre-COVID shoppers? So pre-COVID, we realized, and it's all over in the literature and industry as well, that grocery shopping online was very rare. And in Canada and generally in North America and in Western countries. So we found that in China and other Asian countries, it was just a norm that people shop via their phones, via online for food. However, in Western countries, it was very much different. So we found that only 2% of Canadians were actually shopping online. We conducted a research, a survey, consumer behavior survey, with 1,028 respondents, and found that there was we found in our survey 13% of the consumers were actually shopping online. We also found that males seem to have been more involved in online shopping than females. And whenever females tend to shop, they were actually using click and collect. That is, they shop online, and then instead of allowing the groceries to come to their door, they still go to the store to pick it up. So we decided to inquire some more to find out who are these consumers and try to characterize them. And we were able to segment them based on their attitudes and their intentions. We found the enthusiasts. And the enthusiasts, we were able to recognize that they had very high attitude about, they love the idea of shopping online. They love the technology. They love doing this. They had high aptitude, and the intentions to shop online were actually very high. We also found the potentials. We described them actually as potentials because they had about above average high attitudes, but the intentions were basically very low. They was above average as well, sorry. And however, they were not actually shopping online. And then the other group of consumers, the fence sitters, they actually had high attitude, so they respect the technology. They were warm, had warm feelings towards it. However, the intentions were actually no. And then, of course, we had the traditionalists who just decides, well, this online grocery shopping is just not for me. I'm not doing it, and hence that characterized good. So come COVID, we realized that or expected that consumers' behaviors are absolutely going to change. And so there was an astronomical increase in the number of people who were actually shopping online, almost 50%. And their intentions to shop online were greater. However, there was something that was a bit suspicious about it. We found 98% of consumers were still accessing in-store. So it turned out that consumers were only using online shopping some of the times. So instead of going to the grocery store 3 times a week, they probably were using online shopping at least once a week and going to the grocery store at least 3 times a week. We also conducted a sort of hypothetical experiment by giving them $100 and asked them to spend that money to see exactly where they were going to spend. And it turned out that $74, on average $74, was actually spent in store, while only $18 was spent online. So it sort of confirmed what we know, that consumers desire to be in store. There is a connection, especially among Western consumers, with the food, the touch, that they want to taste it in the store, they want to feel it. I guess much less so now that we're during COVID. They want to feel it. They want to be able to have that intimate connection with the food. The key insights that we were able to find, however, on female shoppers, though, we found that the attitude during COVID was much better than male consumers. They tend to believe that the online grocery shopping will actually protect them from getting COVID, and so they opted to the option. They perceived it as safer, but they expected a lot more of the technology. The online grocery platform, the web stores are not as interactive. It doesn't offer them the in-store experience. And so they were actually demanding a lot more. And also they maintain the click and collect behavior by actually going online and shop, but still going to the store to pick it up, as opposed to allowing it to come to their houses. I don't know. We have to figure this. Males, however, they were more radical, and they were ready to introduce new technology, and so they actually were open for drone technology to deliver the groceries at home, and all sorts of things that the female consumer would not opt to. Unfortunately, in investigating the impact of COVID on the female consumers, we found that more females became unemployed during the pandemic. And we know some of the consequences, and of course we know some of the causes as well, because the children at home and many women would have had to give up their jobs, etc. But unfortunately, twice as many of them were unemployed, even in our sample, even before the pandemic, compared to males. Also, they were predominantly responsible for shopping and cooking and all the household labor and everything that comes with it. And we also know that they expected the technological readiness was not so much about enjoying the technology, but it was much more about the convenience, being able to shop online conveniently, and which the current system doesn't allow. Again, as Simon said earlier, we are academics, so we had to move from the descriptive. The descriptives helps the industry, and that's important for practice. But for us as academic, we also want to have some significant theoretical contributions and insights. And so we pursued further investigation to try to understand the consumer using structural equation modeling. And we actually use a theory called the goal-directed model, which it studies behavior. I don't know if you're aware of planned behavior, human behavior theory, and it allowed us to look some more into some of the factors that are actually influencing the consumer's behavior. So we look at the consumer technological readiness. We looked at consumer learning at some point. We also look at their positive anticipated emotions, how they feel about shopping online, what are some of the negative emotions that they feel, some of the social issues and social norms. We also look at consumers' attitude, and to allow us to predict consumers' behavior. And in that study, we were able to find that all of these constructs was able to explain the variance in our model and thus predicting consumers' behavior. And therefore that was a significant theoretical contribution to the literature, which we're in the process of publishing. So thank you for your time. Our references, I think you might have read them all already. And like I said, it benefits the industry. And thank you. Any questions? I guess we'll have it right now.
Oh, there will be questions. There will be questions. That's great.
Sure.
Thanks, everyone. Those are all really interesting introductions to some pretty complex topics. Sophie, did you want to start with a question, or shall I?
I can start with a small question. Well, not small, but more focused question. Really early on, Noah asked when you were presenting, Emily, about safe break rooms in grocery stores for workers. And I think mentioned that there weren't necessarily. Did you find in your research that employees talked a lot about the safe break rooms, but also their safety in general, and were dissatisfied with it or satisfied with it?
Yeah, that was a topic that did come up a lot about how initially, you know, you had to maintain 6 feet distance, but then everyone would go on break at the same time and be in the break room. And then eventually some stores started to put different things in place so that things were staggered, or there weren't more than 2 or 3 people in the break room at a time. But generally in the beginning, workers did feel very unsafe. And then as they talked about more protective measures being put in place, like the plexiglass, like stickers on the floor, so most grocery stores had like announcements going and signage, and all these kinds of things help them to feel more safe. But I think that the sense of risk is always there. You're touching things that other people have touched. And in terms of breaks, another thing that came up is I recall one participant talking about that while they really appreciated the wage increase, what would have been more beneficial during this time was, you know, an extra 5 minutes on their breaks, or, you know, an extra 20 minutes for lunch, because when you're standing there all day ringing up orders nonstop with these long lines, they felt that the job was much harder. And also you're scrambling to both clean your till, sanitize everything, and get people in and out of the store. So there were a lot of challenges there.
Thank you. I also wondered about that in the meat processing industry, where we've seen a number of outbreaks, and how safe the employees there feel. But yeah, that would be another interesting research. Ryan, you have a question?
Yeah, then in fact, you kind of segued nicely to one that I was hoping to ask, which is thinking about different parts of the food supply system, from production, you know, temporary workers that are collecting the food, distribution, retail, food service. Are there any particular subsets of that system that seem to be more resilient to a situation like this than others? For example, are there certain kinds of foods that are more resilient in terms of producing or distributing them? Are there particular areas that have been revealed to be especially dangerous for workers? You know, is it restaurants? Is it the meat production plants and so on? Are some more prone to shortages or price increases? I guess just where do we sort of see those? Where did it bend and where did it almost break in the supply chain from those different perspectives? And I sort of imagine everybody will have something to kind of add on that. But Evan, I know you've talked about this in some detail. So your thoughts on where are the pressure points, and are they going to be getting better, I guess, is one question.
I mean, it's a great question. It's almost too big. There's so much to talk about. I mean, one of the things that I learned when I was interviewing folks for the Growing Stronger program was that, you know, the meatpacking industry got a lot of attention. And there were definitely problems within the meatpacking industry in terms of the physical arrangement of the way the meat facilities were actually organized, which didn't allow for social distancing on the floors. But the majority of the virus seems to have actually transmitted while people were commuting and carpooling together. And in Alberta, a huge number of the people who work in the meatpacking industry come from Filipino backgrounds and all live together. So it wasn't as simple as the issue was simply, can we put plexiglass dividers into where the workers divide out the workers like they did in the grocery store? It was actually like the carpooling and the living arrangements and the whole sort of social complex that made that industry particularly vulnerable. And the common denominator there is what they call congregate settings, whether that's an old age home or a hospital or a meatpacking plant or a dormitory where temporary foreign workers are staying. It's those congregate settings that prove to be particularly vulnerable. By the flip, the parts of the system that were very resilient were the ones that didn't have a lot of labor in them. And you know, the grain farmers, for instance, where one grain farmer on a giant combine harvester harvesting 10,000 hectares, there's no virus going to be transmitted there. And I've got some friends that, they were bored and they were lonely and all the rest of that stuff, but their contribution to the food system was unaffected.
In terms of food service or retail, are we seeing particular? I mean, we heard a little bit about fast food versus your more common sit-down kinds of restaurants, but are there differences maybe across chains versus small businesses, or large grocery stores versus the markets and things like that? Is there some difference you could see in terms of the size of the operation in affecting resilience, or how the employees experience the process, or what have you? I guess would be a question maybe any of the other three, I suppose, are actually could talk about that perhaps.
I think probably in our work, the businesses were very sort of restaurant type rather than chain. And looking at the people that I talked with outside of this study, just in food service, I think some of the chains, a lot of the chains are franchises that are owned by, and they sort of have to work. They have head office gives them some direction about how to do things, particularly product and the way things are produced. But some of those regulations that they need to follow are very much based on the local healthcare unit or the local province, and which just then makes everything very messy. So I can't really say that any sort of franchise chain, fast or quick service versus full service would have been a hell of a lot different. I think probably what would have been the fine dining end of the supply chain suffered the most. They were really about getting people into a place around a table, as many people as you can get, selling them lots of wine and beer and everything else that's high margin in food service. And that's how you make your money, because you don't make that much money on food. And obviously with COVID, we couldn't put people around a table. So those ones hurt more than those where it's get it eat it, get out type operations.
Right.
I wonder on this, Simon, like, so the fine dining industry seems to be, like, it's particularly affected, of course. And so are you seeing some discussions of what's going to happen to that industry? Because even now, even if they can have people in the restaurant, it's going to be so socially distanced, and it just, they don't have as many tables. They have to clean between people. And so they can't make as much of a profit. So are they surviving well? And is this something, are we going to see a shift in fine dining, or is it going to come back exactly as before? Are there some discussions around that?
Yeah, I think there's two angles to that. I always go back to the basic fundamental of any business or enterprise is revenue minus cost equals profit. So if you look at either maximize your profit by maximizing your revenue or minimizing your cost. So the first thing that we're doing was looking at the costs of overall business operation, whether it's fast service or full service, and seeing how, you know, you can cut down your ingredients, cut down your menu, try to be as efficient and as cheap as possible. You know, try to have, obviously you've got to have less people in a space, so that means unfortunately less workers, but try to make that most as efficient, and then try to maximize your price, increase price maybe a little bit, which was tricky. I think at the end of the day, people want to go to a place and sit there with a glass of wine and a beer and something to eat and meet with friends and celebrate birthdays and all that other stuff, and that will always be there, I think. It will take some, obviously, time to come, and after we've got a vaccine, but I think they're the ones who've suffered the most. They're probably sitting back and waiting for the right moment. But the fundamentals of what made those full service restaurants popular prior to COVID will always be there. So that demand should be there.
I was asking from an interested perspective.
I was going to ask about buffets for the same reason.
Yeah.
Yeah, those seem to be. Who knows if those are coming back?
Buffet is, I mean, I don't like, well, the buffet issue is an interesting one on that. It is the biggest waste of food you can ever have in a restaurant, right, where people pick and choose but don't eat everything. And a la carte, where you order off a menu, is far more efficient from a waste perspective. But buffet, yeah, you know, it seems to be that COVID doesn't spread with food, but it doesn't help when people are standing next to each other getting food. And yeah, but I think the days of buffets are probably out in some respect.
Mm-hmm.
That's a major shift for some chains then.
It is. The all-you-can-eat crowd exists, and that's fine. And I think that it's going to take some time. I mean, it's business operations, particularly at the hotel level, you know, the breakfast buffet is part of the way they run that service during the day. And that goes for a lot of hotels, restaurants, basically, that exist everywhere, because it's a quick, convenient way of people coming in, grabbing some food, and then going off to business meetings or their holiday or whatever it may be. And I think that's going to be tricky because particularly if you think about how business travel and buffet works, you have people who come in, we've all probably done conferences or business trips where everyone eats at the same time, and then everyone sort of leaves relatively at the same time, but a little bit spread out, but pretty much that case. But to do that a la carte, where you order off a menu, is tricky for that type of, for most of those types of hotel restaurants. So yeah, I think we're still scratching our heads a little bit on that one, but I think we'll see.
Cool.
Right. Emily, any thoughts on the kinds of, I mean, I guess you looked at a bunch of different aspects, right? So you've got the kind of store, I suppose, but then you've even got within the store. So, you know, the use of self-checkout versus, you know, actual human cashiers, and the pickup versus whatever. Did you see, were there some parts that were fine, or were there some that were clearly stressed? I mean, you know, self-checkout lines just became obviously untenable under this, or something along those lines?
Yeah, definitely. There were different departments within a grocery store where I would say affected much differently. And even what I would characterize as different types of grocery store, even within our small sample of like focusing on major brands, to me, I'd characterize theirs as a more upscale grocery store compared to Food Basics or a No Frills. Because within those types of grocery stores, they have sections where there's a deli, there's hot food where you can buy, like lunch to go. So in a lot of those types of areas of the grocery store, those sections were completely closed down. And even in those types of areas that are also coupled with clothing retail, with a Joe Fresh, most of that area was closed down as well. And large sections of the store were repurposed to make room for areas to fulfill those online orders. And so stores that didn't have online ordering didn't really see those kind of shifts within the store of rearranging of merchandise or closing down of specific sections. And then another thing that came up is that some of the more upscale stores during the summer also had garden centers, and that these areas were, I had one participant who got switched from one section to go help in the garden section, and those areas were cleaned out. People were really into planting and buying the necessary things that they needed for home gardening during that time.
Right. Kimberly, did you find any particular kinds of things people were willing to buy online? I mean, I kind of imagine something like produce, maybe they were more reluctant than boxes of cereal or something.
Yeah,
like that.
in our previous study, we found that they were more likely to buy beers and water and skin products, but less likely to buy meat and vegetables. So I think, the more perishable the product is, and the more intimate it becomes to the consumer, and the more concerned they are about how you interact with it.
Yeah, and more variable too, I suppose. I mean, a can of soup is probably pretty similar across the shelf, but bananas, they're all, you kind of want to check them out. So yeah, I can see that being a real issue. Sophie, did you want to go ahead?
I have a bunch of questions, but I have one related to the last, to your questions to Emily and Kimberly while we're on the topic, because I'm glad you brought up gardening, Emily, because Rashida asked, she said like she just got the impression everybody got to garden this summer. And so linked to this discussion, it made me think, has that happened in the food chain more broadly, where beyond the toilet paper, this is another example, gardening, like where you're saying like the stores were just like, were there other examples of some things that weren't planned and all of a sudden were in huge demand besides gardening,
Flour.
toilet paper? Well, flour too, yeah. Or things that we might not have thought about, because yeah, we know the toilet paper and flour everybody talks about, right?
Evan, did you want to say something on that one?
Well, it was interesting. Sorry, Emily, did you want to jump in?
No, go ahead.
All right. Well, I mean, one of the big ones was this collapse in market for potatoes, because we eat potatoes as French fries in restaurants and we don't eat potatoes at home. So that was a loss of demand, skyrocketing demand for anything involving home baking. But it wasn't necessarily the rise in demand that caused the shortages at the grocery store. So for eggs, for instance, when a restaurant buys eggs, they buy them in 144 egg flats. When a person buys eggs, they typically buy in a 12 dozen carton. And it was the loss of the cartoning and the lack of the carton packaging, which caused eggs to go short for weeks and months at a time. And it wasn't the flour that went scarce. It was the 2 kilogram yellow Robin Hood bags put the flour in that went scarce. And so it was a weird reorganization of the chain. It wasn't necessarily scarcity in the chain. But the implications of this actually, I think, are a very profound interest in relocalizing some of our key supply chains. And this may make economic sense, or it may be economically irrational to do that. I'm hearing a huge amount of interest in people figuring out ways of bringing things close to home, which could be gardening. And having done some studies on the productivity of most gardeners, myself included, we make a small number of very expensive salads when you start thinking about the labor and the cost of setting up your garden and all the stuff you buy at
Delicious, though.
Canadian Tire. But it is pretty, it is, yeah, I'm not denying the quality, but it is not, you're not doing it because it's a food security strategy. You're doing it because it's a fun thing to do. And there's a bunch of other things that sort of fall into that category. And you know, we're seeing that issue with, say, vaccines. You know, we don't have a domestic supply of vaccines because we've always relied on international trade for that. Well, maybe we don't want to be doing that in the future. And there's some serious debates about that.
That really quick leads to one of the questions I actually had in terms of impacts on international food supply chains. Is there a strong push in the same way that there's the discussion about vaccines to have more emphasis on things we grow and produce in Canada, for example, and are other countries doing the same thing, so that you're going to see a lot more stuff that is locally grown versus imports? Is there been a knock-on effect on international trade in food?
Maybe I'll take that one.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I think the interesting part is that Canada makes about 80% of the food that's made in Canada. Well, 80% of the food that is consumed in Canada is made in Canada. And typically, if you look at a grocery store, that what we call the center store, those aisles where you get boxed, packaged, what we call shelf-stable product, is most of where that is Canadian made. And most of those products, generally speaking, from a price perspective, are relatively stable. They go up by 1 or 2% per year, and you know, sometimes there's discounts and that type of thing. But where it gets really expensive is the peripheral store, so the outside. So fruits and vegetables, meat. Those are the parts that we see massive price increases. We're part of the Canada's Food Price Report that we release each year, and you know, we're predicting a 4.5% to 6% increase in the price of food in Canada for this year, of which the biggest ones are always fruits and vegetables and meat. And I think fruits and vegetables is probably the one where we struggle, because if we look outside now, obviously Johnson Hall behind me doesn't look like that. It's covered in snow. We just can't produce outside 365 days a year like countries where I'm originally from, which is Australia, can do. So there is this thing, well, let's localize, and that works to some extent. But we are still very much struck by seasons. There's technology. We have a greenhouse, the indoor farming sector, which produces, particularly now, tomatoes, lettuce, cucumbers, peppers that we can eat at this time of year that are made here. And, you know, with a good investment, we could increase the efficiency of those. We've seen a downturn in the cannabis sector where there's lots of greenhouses sitting there with nothing in them that we could be repurposing. But agricultural policy is very much focused in Canada around maintaining the status quo of farming. And we spend $3 billion a year to maintain that in what we call business risk management programs. And those programs are important. They help stabilize agricultural production. But if we could take a little bit of that money and put it towards increasing alternative ways of producing food here. And I've got the co-chair of the Canadian Food Policy Council on this call, so this could be a suggestion for him. But just a suggestion that we could look at more indoor farming and those types of what we call controlled environment agriculture. So I think those things, I think at the end of the day, we did well with food supplies because we had borders open. We import a lot from the US. We had shortages, but they were relatively, and outages, but they were relatively short-term and in certain product categories. But if we didn't have a border that was open, we would have been in serious trouble. So I think a mix of local and imports will always be the case.
That's so interesting, Simon, because I wanted to ask Evan, well, first of all, I should say, anybody that's in Aurelia right now, Diane is missing BAM spray. I don't know if you've seen that in the chat. Anyway, so because I wanted to ask Evan about, you know, this sentence you had, the systems bent, but it did not break, but it almost did a few times. And so, Simon, you were talking about one of the reasons it was sustainable is the like not, it worked as the borders were still open. But I wondered, Evan, can you elaborate on what you meant by that? And the part that I want you to elaborate on if possible is, but it almost broke up a few times. And what would it mean for it to break? I think as somebody that is a fan of dystopian science fiction, I guess, or horror stories, but what would it mean for it to break, and how close did it come to breaking?
So that was a direct quote from a person that helps organize and runs one of our largest grocery chains. And I went into that particular interview thinking things had gone actually surprisingly well. And they did go surprisingly well, but he impressed on me the cost, the amount of work, the sweat, blood, and tears, the endless nights to actually keep the grocery store shelves full and to get them to restock as quickly as they did following that rush of panic buying in March. So it was that, I mean, he really impressed on me that it, by May, I went back to no frills and went, it's all fine. Wow, that's pretty good. And he was like, yeah, it was pretty good, but a crap ton of work went into that, and a humongous amount of cost went into that. And so we shouldn't take that kind of resilience for granted. And then he described how, key food ingredients like sanitizers to keep the dairy industry safe from diseases. Well, all of our sanitizers were going into giving ourselves, the squirty stuff for our hands, which is appropriate, but there was a shortage for sanitizers for the dairy industry and the meat processing industry. So there could have been a food safety problem. There could have been serious amounts of food price inflation. And, we did see food bank use more or less double. So the system kind of did okay for those of us who are privileged and have money. But, for the people that Emily interviewed, they worked really, really, really hard. And they didn't really get well compensated or well regarded for that. And for low-income Canadians, the system broke, and they relied on food, on charity, in the millions and millions of families. So, I mean, it wasn't a dystopian zombies apocalypse, because I share your interest in and your love of post-apocalyptic sci-fi. Read it all the time. Maybe that's why I don't sleep. But we've gone through a rough patch. There's no question. And I know Emily's got stuff to say on this one as well.
I would disagree with everything that you said, Evan. And that, in times where even within Guelph, some of the stores that I interviewed, there were outbreaks at the store, and the store had to be shut down for 24 hours with a huge cleaning crew to come in and desanitize the store and these kinds of things. So there were those things that happened that were very frightening for people who are working on the front lines. And I think for the rest of us who are safe working from home, didn't exactly get to see that and didn't actually feel those experiences. And now that we're kind of entering even a different stage with a virus that it has variants and is transmitting differently, like, we need to take the lessons learned from this round of things and think about how we're moving forward to ensure that we're safe.
I think, Emily, you've hit a really important point, which is it so happens that this particular pandemic, the virus, isn't transmitted on surfaces. We've had people talking about tests they did on grocery bags and, surfaces that people were touching. Turns out this one is not transmitted that way, but imagine if it were. So the next one, maybe it will be, right? And you sort of think, okay, so the system bent in certain ways this time, given the biology of this particular virus. But if you had a different kind of transmission system, it might have been a really different situation for food supply, for all of that sort of thing. And so I guess, do you see us having learned anything about potential risk? I mean, because people were asking those questions. Is it transmitted by your grocery bags, by handling the food? Food delivery, if somebody is sat at the table before you in a restaurant, those sorts of questions. Have we sort of do you get a sense people have thought about, okay, what if the next one, and most epidemiologists, I think, will tell you there's going to be another one. What if it were transmitted in a different way? Have we learned anything, I guess, to prepare for that?
I would like to say that hopefully we have, and I think with some of the work that researchers have been doing about what we have learned, in talking to people who were on the front lines, grocery store workers were like, yeah, I don't understand why this bylaw about mask wearing didn't come into effect months earlier. I was wearing a mask every day to work since the beginning of March. Like these kinds of things that like we knew, but we didn't have the political will to support. And I think in the next round of things, hopefully not, but I would hope that there would be a stronger political will to make the right decisions and to be based on evidence. And these are popular decisions. I do remember at that time, people were trying to convince people that they had to wear a mask in store and reminding people how to wear it properly. And now we're a year into this, like hopefully everyone is doing that. And even out in stores, I see people who aren't. So like, we want to say we've learned something, but I think trying to normalize and make those hard decisions about rules and regulations quicker will be super important for safety going forward.
So I did a year of a postdoc in New York City, and I remember going to the post office there, and they have security glass, and it's it felt to me very weird compared to what you would experience in a Canadian post office, right, or small town post office. And it sort of shades of that a little bit with plexiglass in stores and so on. And I guess the question I might have is, are those coming out? Like, are we going to have no plexiglass again, or are they pretty much here to stay? That's our new way of interacting with service employees.
Yeah, so that was one of our wrap-up questions in our interviews with employees of what do you think are going to be lasting changes? And that was almost a unanimous thing that people said plexiglass is here to stay. I don't think these are going to come out of the store anytime soon. Some people thought eventually we won't be wearing masks, but yeah, and even myself at the time that we were doing this research in July and talking with people, didn't think we'd be where we are now. Well, didn't think the second wave would be as bad. So like, yeah, right. Things are changing, but I think a lot of the things that have been put in place in terms of grocery stores, plexiglass, max capacity, respecting that, will be things that we'll be seeing for a long time.
This discussion is making me, and the side chat on Dystopia is making me rethink, because I only have a plan for the zombie apocalypse, which involves giant tiger. It digresses from the topic tonight, but I need more plans, because there's more than the zombie apocalypse I need to be prepared for. I wonder, Kimberly, because, on online shopping, it's interesting because online grocery shopping prior to the pandemic, my experience was in two ways. My mom is 80 years old plus, and she shops online, been shopping online for quite a while. So in a sense for us as her children, it wasn't very stressful. She knew how, she knew, right? And then when I broke my foot, a few years ago, it just became really critical, but that was it, right? But I don't know, moving out of this, I think I will likely do some more or be more open to shopping online. I wonder, and there was Joshua who also asked about whether there's going to be cool like virtual reality grocery stores, or are you seeing cool apps? Are you seeing potential innovations that really take us? Because I agree, now hearing you, I realize my bill at Shoppers Drug Mart in person is way higher than my bill at Shoppers Drug Mart online, right? Because I like to go in the store and see the new products and all that kind of stuff, and end up buying, oh my God. And so how much are retailers interested in recreating those experiences that make us buy when we're in stores now?
Okay, thanks. So that's a great question. So it actually, you're asking for artificial intelligence on your web platform, where it's going to start suggesting things that you like and intriguing you based on your behavior. And but the platforms are not that sophisticated. They're basically, you go online, and that's one of the main complaints of consumers, that they cannot see the range of product offerings. They're not able to choose what they like, or the best options. And so I believe it will get there, because consumers, we have been doing some interviews after, because surveys are great, but when you really want to get the depth of the understanding, you have to do interviews. And so you're hearing that consumers, they want the options. And we also found that when people have these circumstances, a pregnant woman, or a broken leg, elderly mom, you tend to rely a lot more. So there are these segments that grocery stores can specifically just target. But the other thing regarding the technology, so we're also doing research on smart retailing, which is the use of your cell phone, for instance, on not going to checkout at all, but just using the technology, probably through your cell phone or your cart, to just walk in, pick up your groceries, and walk out. And there is somewhat of a demand for that, for people who are experiencing a lifestyle of being very time poor. So I think grocery stores are going to have to provide a cocktail of options for different types of consumers. But I think the general population, they're going to be in the traditional way, you wanting to go to the grocery store the traditional way and do the traditional thing, until some circumstances come up where they have to do otherwise. So I think that it has to do with a lot of target marketing and really getting to understand the consumer and the consumer experiences that they're expecting, and targeting that consumer and giving them what they want.
Yep.
So much, Ryan. I think that's it. Yeah.
So I don't know if we're getting a little short on time, but a question I might have just to each of our experts tonight. We hear a lot about going back to normal, return to normalcy, and it's often pointed out that normal wasn't that great for a lot of people, or in a lot of ways. So I guess my question would be, if you had one or a small number of things that have changed that you hope won't go back to the way they were, either in your own experience or from your standpoint and your expertise, can you kind of point to something that you kind of hope stays the way it is under these circumstances for the foreseeable future? I think
maybe I'll go first.
Oh, go ahead. Sure. Yep.
Yeah, I think if you look from the perspective of my study, it was a case where everything was taken away, and now we're trying to look for it to come back in some ways. But regardless of my research that I've talked about today, I also study out other parts of the food supply chain. So looking at that, I think that it's tough to pin down one thing. I've been racking my brain the last few seconds. I mean, I think the buffet example is a nice one, where wastes that we needed, a lot of things that we needed another excuse to get rid of, and COVID created that excuse. And I think some of the wasting things that we've seen, like buffets, are probably one. But maybe if I flip it round to what we hope could be made better after this, that I think that the business perspective is that times of crises create opportunity for those that have, I'm not going to use the P word, the pivot word, but I just said it then, but have changed, have started up a new business or done something a little bit different, have tried to meet consumer needs. And I think that we've seen that with the way we've seen digital technologies like Kimberly's talked about, and adoption of those. We've seen meal kits where people were, all your food is delivered and you assemble it. There's still a few problems with meal kits, particularly with waste, but people have been able to trial those things during COVID and then the business model adapts. So a little bit roundabout, but I think there's a few things that, things will change.
Those are great to kind of hear that. I mean, I often reflect on things. The one that comes to my mind often is the format of Senate meetings. So I don't know if you've been on those, but you know, in a large room, essentially 3 hours, 100 people, no break, and to go to the washroom, you have to get up and walk in front of everyone, and you got to wait for the microphone. Versus online, you know, you turn your camera off, you can stretch out, everyone's able to ask questions. I kind of hope that stays. You know, yes, Beth, it's better, right? So yeah, I think there.
A lot of us like online Senate.
Yeah, excellent point. Kimberly, what about you? Is there anything that you hope stays?
Well, I think in general, COVID, I think it would have displaced a lot of people and their normal way of life. I think the most vulnerable people are being affected, and the most, unfortunately. And so there are some things that you really don't want to stay. You want the restaurants to open again. You want people to be able to start working in the restaurant, and you don't want people to be cooking all their meals
Right.
because you want to create jobs. And but I believe based on our study, we have seen that people have been more accepting of the technology, and I think we're going on that trajectory. I don't expect it to change. I think there might be some migration back to old patterns, but now I think even the traditionalists in our during COVID study, even their attitudes improved compared to pre-COVID study. So I think there's going to be a greater acceptance of technology, which has really bailed us out during this pandemic.
Great. Yeah. Evan?
Yeah, I've been scribbling notes down here.
If you're not ready, I can skip you for now.
No. We'll give Emily the last word. Hey,
I was thinking that, but go ahead.
I think I've got three things, and one's very much food and production related. And I think there is an opportunity, because there's all this interest in, quote, bringing food home and not relying on imports as much, and thinking of technologies to solve things. I want to be delicate with my words. Strawberries from California in January are terrible pieces of food. And if we can invest in technologies, and COVID causes us to invest in the technologies to create year-round decent quality strawberries in Ontario, I will be a happier person. And that's a metaphor because of things that I think we can fix in the food system. The second thing is, I think we have a chance now to, in my career anyways, have the best conversation ever about addressing the root causes of food insecurity. And I think we've been so shocked by the economic fallout and the way it's thrust vulnerable, precarious people into food insecurity. The other big story of the year, of course, was Black Lives Matter and the highly racialized elements of food insecurity, and the fact that BIPOC people experience food insecurity far worse than white people do. And we're openly talking about these issues now. And I think there is actually a fighting chance at having a conversation about the root causes. So I think we can do a lot of good, both at the producer end and the consumer end, with COVID and 2020 as a catalyst. And then personally, I mean, I've spent the last year sitting in this bedroom, pacing up and down, and I've been kind of miserable, and I don't want that to be forever. And I've actually had the most productive year of my career. I've written more papers, I've given more talks, I've done more policy work, I've sat on more committees. And that's because I'm not flinging my body around the planet all the time. I do not want to fly to Europe for a night ever again. I do not want to do back-to-back red eyes so I can do a meeting in Vancouver ever again. I can run a big international organization and be a successful academic from my bedroom. I don't want to be 100% in my bedroom, Believe me, I want to get out, but I don't want to go back to what I was doing 12 months ago. The planet doesn't need me to do it. My body, my family do not need me to do that. And I am so grateful to COVID for giving me this year of reminding myself that I can do things differently.
Great point. And Emily, to you.
Yeah, I think these are all great things to stay. I have two things that I've been thinking about, and one, even though it's already been taken away, the $2 additional heroes pay to minimum wage workers, there's more of a movement towards getting a more beneficial living wage to these workers now. People are realizing that, you know, you shouldn't be working 40 hours a week in this country and be food insecure and be housing insecure. It doesn't make sense, especially if you're an essential frontline worker. And so we're seeing more movement around things like paid sick days for these workers so that, you know, they're not coming to work sick, benefits for workers. Something that we asked about in the study that we didn't get a lot of data on was asking about workers, essential workers who had children during this time when daycares and schools were closed. So thinking about more social programs to help support parents who are also essential workers. So I think there's more movement behind these things now that were a huge problem before COVID, and that now that it's brought some of these things to light, hopefully we'll see more movement on social protections for workers in this country. And the second thing that I think that's good to stay is that our grocery stores are a lot cleaner than they used to be. So hearing stories about the amount of cleaning that has gone into grocery stores, talking about people wiping down shelves that they thought had never been wiped before, all these kinds of things. It's good to wipe the carts down every now and then. So I think it makes our grocery stores a generally healthier and safer place from all the viruses and things that are transmittable out there. So it's nice I think that's good to see that, and I think that extra work and responsibility also needs to be acknowledged in compensation to these workers.
Wow, great answers, everyone. Thank you so much for that. I do see we are very close to the end of our time, so I
think this was a perfect end to the evening.
Yeah, really, really great. It's interesting to kind of to reflect back, I think, at this point a year in from where we were, you know, in March thinking about food security issues or food supply issues and stuff. And I think we've all kind of adjusted enough and have a lot more confidence in the resiliency of the system, but we're still learning a lot of things that are kind of not the same, and maybe we don't want them to be. And it's interesting to kind of keep reflecting as we experience it. It's always sort of a different situation. Yeah, really appreciate all of you coming and joining us tonight and sharing your insights and expertise. Just really fascinating.
Yeah.
I think we're seeing a lot of it in the chat as well. It was just a great discussion. Colin, do you have the slides? We'll just remind you about what's happening next week. Yeah, so next week is COVID-19 and non-human animals. And we're going to have 3 panelists from 2 different departments, population medicine and pathobiology represented. And should be another really interesting discussion.
And Cocolio is going to be there.
We will have at least 1 non-human animal in attendance, as always.
Yes.
If you have any questions, don't forget you can access the CourseLink forum. You can talk to your teaching assistant, or if for the alumni in particular, if you don't have access to those, you can always use the course email, unif2020@uofguelph.ca. Thanks everybody for a great evening. I heard a great quote today, which was stay positive and test negative. And I think I'll maybe try to steal that, and wish everyone the best.
Yes, thank you so much to our panelists. This was amazing and so interesting. And thank you as usual to the audience and the questions in the chat. Really great. And see you next week.
Yep. Cheers. Good night,
Thank
everybody.
you. Thank you for having us. Thank you for having me.
Thank you
Bye.
so much, Kimberly.
See you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Nice to meet you. Bye.
Great job, guys. It was excellent.
Thank you.
Hey, Malcolm.
Hey, Malcolm.
guys.
Nice to see you.
Bye.
Excellent job, Kimberly, Emily, Simon, Evan. Great job.
Thank you, Malcolm.